Sarah King is the head of Greenpeace Canada's Oceans and Plastics campaign, pushing for a plastics-free future by holding corporations accountable for the growing plastics pollution crisis. Sarah's worked to protect our oceans and ocean-dependent communities for over a decade. She studied in the Environmental Applied Science and Management program at Toronto Metropolitan University and has worked at a consulting firm doing environmental impact assessments in order to help determine the scope of negative impacts associated with various development projects. I speak with her about the place of plastics in our everyday lives, the impact that plastics have on the environment, and the many ways that the Trudeau government's plastics ban is woefully inadequate. I won't summarize everything that Sarah explains here, but I will quote a particularly pithy summary of her position. She says that, in fact, the entire category of single-use plastics is a problem because of the overwhelming scale of production and our lacking in disjointed infrastructure. She stresses that the government is actually very scared to take strong action to hold industry accountable. The result tends to be policies that benefit industry and do nothing to protect the environment. Loopholes can be found throughout Canada's environmental regulations, and that means profit over survival. We have a new set of policies that the Liberal government is claiming will give us a zero plastic waste future by 2030. But King is very pointed in her assertion that actually the government has to know that this is a false promise. In her words, they have to be looking at that target knowing that it's impossible, given the state of environmental protections in this country and the incredibly minor push to end plastics production and pollution. Confronting industry and closing loopholes is all about moving radically in a different direction. King says that embracing a reuse and refill revolution would legitimately signal the end of the plastic era and begin to seriously challenge our fossil fuel dependent system in which the wrong things are valued. Getting to that entirely reasonable, feasible alternative will take a project of accelerated solidarity building though, because the lobby for fossil fuels and petrochemicals is very strong. For this reason, King is really looking for more alignment between segments of the environmental movement. We're starting to see this and to see a shift both toward the centering of the people that are most impacted when it comes to crafting solutions and a way forward, and toward, as Sarah puts it, addressing not just our planetary crisis, but also our social justice crises around the world. It's a pivotal moment in many ways that the solutions that we're starting to see emerge right now in terms of responding to the plastics pollution crisis, are obviously in many ways too little, too late. Like you write in one article that we really needed these solutions yesterday, and this is a problem that is cumulative, where the often cited statistic that we recycle maybe as low as 8%, maybe even lower of our plastic. It's like that doesn't tell the full story in terms of the cumulative problem, which is that we've only ever recycled that much. And so that is becoming apparent, and now we're starting to see these solutions, but there's a belatedness to them. And so I wanted to ask you, first of all, about that question, I guess, of awakening to some extent. Like you talk about the fact that, and I think this is not known to a lot of people, every stage of plastic's life cycle pollutes. And I wanted to ask you to kind of relate this to the disaster unfolding in East Palestine, Ohio, where you have, massive plumes of incinerated vinyl chloride, especially a key ingredient in PVC, poisoning residents across 3 U.S. states. Do you think these sorts of focusing events can help people begin to come to terms with, or not come to terms with, but confront the catastrophic effects of basically like neoliberal deregulation and the volatile oil economy? Like how aware of the whole process of plastics production and distribution do you think the public is right now?
I think that people haven't been that aware of what it takes to create the plastic bottle or that plastic wrap around their numerous goods that they purchase in a week at their local grocery store. I think that when we think of plastic pollution, the problem to some extent has been out of sight for a lot of people living in Canada. Um, if you're not participating in a shoreline cleanup, if you're not out on the water, if you're not living in a coastal community, then you may not think that the problem is as big as it is. Um, and I think, we weren't taught these kinds of things in school. What are things made of? Where do things come from? We've seen more and more people ask questions around their food, but I think we're not at a place yet where people are asking these questions about everything in their lives, because, also that's exhausting to do.
Mm-hmm.
It's so hard for people to navigate and try to figure out how to make all, the quote right choices. And there's so much pressure on the consumer to be making the right choice all the time. And so when we think of plastic, from extraction of the fossil fuel all the way through to disposal, and even once it's pollution, it's contributing to the climate crisis, it's contributing to the biodiversity crisis, and it is impacting frontline communities and coastal communities here in Canada and around the world. And I think the more that we connect plastic to oil and plastic to the harms of oil production and oil spills and chemical spills, the more people will realize that, this is more than a waste and a plastic pollution problem. This is, it's a massive crisis, a social and environmental crisis that goes all the way back to our overall economic system. But yeah, bit by bit, we need to be bringing people along and connecting those dots.
Yeah, I really appreciate those insights, like just the idea that we do need a kind of structural overhaul. You talk about a system reboot. Like, I'm very sympathetic to that idea. But I wanted to kind of pick up on something you said about the pressure that we place on consumers, because, like, the fossil fuel industry has been one of the most vocal in plastics industry, being part of it, most vocal in terms of downloading or delegating responsibility really to individual consumers. And I see you in an article on Halloween, thinking through that in some ways. Like, this is I love Halloween, right? It's like this fun ritual. And you're making clear, though, that there is also this overwhelming kind of avalanche of plastic that comes with all of these holidays. And so, like, while you could just like guilt consumers, and even the Guardian is sort of guilty of this, is like just like informing us in ways that are supposed to mobilize our individual like agency, when the problem is all that is out of sight, as you put it, right? The sacrifice zones that most of us are not aware of. And so, like, when we think about something as sort of banal and annual and sort of like automatic as enjoying Halloween, it's the case that, as you put it at the end of that article, it's overwhelming to think about something like that being a plastic-filled occasion, right? And so, to me, what's interesting when it comes to thinking about like just that one event, this yearly event of Halloween, is that for many people, the reason why thinking around plastic is virtually impossible is that it makes the stuff safe. Like, it makes what you consume safe.
Yeah.
And there's like a fundamental irony there, that I think is worth kind of exploring, and that I see you kind of exploring, where you're trying to, on some level, convince people that the thing that you have been taught protects you is actually what is making you most at risk, right? And so,
Yeah.
like, is that part of the idea, is to kind of draw those connections for people?
Definitely. And, I think a lot of us in the advocacy community, and definitely the science community, have struggled about how do we talk about plastic? Because the reality is that we know that a lot of the chemicals used in plastic production and certain types of polymers, have been shown to be toxic and have caused harm and continue to cause harm in various ways, and have been linked to various diseases, even types of cancers. But there has been a lack of science that have made direct connections, between sort of your packaging here is leading to this disease or this negative health outcome here in these people. And so it's been difficult to, share the realities of what goes into plastic and, what the potential negative outcomes could be, while also, speaking from a credible comms perspective, essentially. But we do know that,
Sure.
plastic is toxic. And I think we also know that these findings, that it's been found in our blood, in our lungs and placenta, in, all these parts of our bodies. We know that can't be good. Like it's not meant to be there.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that has struck a chord with people. But again, I think it's still, there's not enough yet being done to say these are the ways that it's entering our body. And that's why we need to take a precautionary approach and not be exposing ourselves to so much of it. And that's where we're seeing the unfortunate lack of action by government is around this precautionary approach when it comes to the human health side.
Yeah, which is so striking. I mean, it's interesting to think about such a violent, volatile event like the explosion of this 150 car train and the 3 cars that contain vinyl chloride, this key element of PVC, being, among the highest profile or, most impactful, let's say, aspects of the story, but also the kind of just struggle to keep it on our screens. And certainly, like, you talk about how, industry has been very good at sort of co-opting certain kinds of terms, but also creating a level of indecision and confusion. And so, yeah, it's really important, as you say, from a communications perspective, to just sort of remind people that while we don't know fundamentally like the full impact of these products, we do know that they're almost certainly toxic, that the kind of unnaturally durable nature of them, the fact that they're based in hydrocarbons, it's almost a no-brainer that these things, especially if we're talking about incinerating them, are bad for us, right?
Yeah.
And one of the things that really resonated with me when I read your writing for Greenpeace is this insight that we can't allow products that are similarly problematic to replace banned ones.
Mm-hmm.
Like, the petrochemical industry is endlessly ambitious about innovating new versions of the same toxic products. So I wondered if you could speak to that ambition and how regulation needs to kind of anticipate it. Like, now we have non-toxic Teflon and like BPS instead of BPA. There's this a kind of zombie-like quality to plastics when we look to try to erase them from the environment.
Yeah, I mean, the government has definitely, whether it comes to certain chemicals or in the case of the single-use plastics ban, certain types of plastic, it's not looking, at a full, say, class of chemicals or a full category of single-use plastics. It's looking, on a case-by-case basis, item by item, and really ignoring the fact that it's actually, when it comes to single-use plastics and packaging, it's actually the entire category that's problematic. And within that category, different types of products or types of packaging are problematic for different reasons. But the entire category is a problem if it ends up in the environment, is, at best suboptimal in waste when it comes to waste management, because even the types of plastics that are the most recyclable and are the most commonly recycled are still, because of our level of production and because of our lacking and disjointed infrastructure, it's still not like it's all being collected and it's all being recycled in this wonderful circular way. So the government has not been taking a holistic approach. It's not been kind of taking a step back and looking at this larger problem of, if we really want to be moving towards a low carbon, truly zero waste, truly circular economy, we have to get serious about the level of production of fossil fuels and fossil fuel products, full stop.
Right.
We can't just be hoping that banning, a bag here or a fork there is going to address the problem. It may result, and it will result, in fewer items and hopefully seen in our community. But yeah, it is allowing for all of these loopholes for industry, as you mentioned, around, well, if a plastic fork meets certain requirements, it can be considered reusable. And then there you go. We just have a bunch of more durable plastic forks that people don't identify as truly reusable. And so they still, end up in the garbage.
Sure.
It's been unfortunate that the government hasn't been looking at, the zero waste hierarchy and really prioritizing, what kind of makes the most sense. If you want less plastic waste and less plastic pollution, you have to create less of it in the first place. And they've just not been willing to really commit to do that.
Mm-hmm. I definitely want to think about like the practical stuff that Greenpeace is suggesting as a kind of radical alternative. But I guess I'm inclined to sort of ask you to, because I think your writing attempts to do this in some ways, is like diagnose the sort of reasons for inaction. I mean, you talk in one article about the need to take a bird's eye view of the system and social structures to kind of try and see the problem holistically. I wondered, though, about how you approach attempting to communicate the need to see the whole system operating and call for a system reprogram while still kind of making the message bridgeable and convincing, for like, let's say the average Canadian, this like hypothetical figure, right?
Yeah.
One of the things you're doing is, for example, pointing to actually existing alternatives, right?
Yeah.
But you're also trying to sort of suggest that there are these vested interests that are invested in blocking progress and calling for that to just stop. Like you literally say, like, cease efforts to block progress, stop glamorizing consumption. So like, is that part of your personal strategy as a communicator, is like talk about these alternatives, but then also try to be explicit about the pathological kinds of things that exist within consumer society that make us mired in plastics?
Yeah. Definitely for me, I'm always like, okay, where do we need to go? Like, what's the vision here? What's the ideal scenario where we're operating within the Earth's limits, where we're not causing harm to people and to wildlife and, to ecosystems. And, of course, how do we get there? And I think, Greenpeace is, of course, known for definitely the shock factor, but also being like trying to raise the bar of what is possible.
Right.
I feel like when I reflect on the plastic-free movement and how it's evolved, in the earlier days, I definitely found that people were really stuck on, like people didn't feel like we could get out of this system, that we are so entrenched in this take, make, waste. Plastic is everywhere. Plastic is in everything. How would we ever get out of this? It's not possible. So how do we make this better? But the reality is, that different ways of operating, different ways of being are actually happening all around us. And they have been ever since plastic really came onto the scene. I mean, there is a better way of being. Like, we can get there. And there are small examples of it all around. We just need to, like, that you're already engaging in your day-to-day life. Something as simple as, you go to a A&W and you put your cup against the fountain machine and you get your drink. That is a form of reuse and refill that can be modified and expanded and, used in various applications that would dramatically reduce the number of single-use vessels in various forms. So I think it's about connecting those dots in the day-to-day life while also not putting the onus always on the person, but saying, if you want to be part of, of the movement to move towards, a healthier, truly zero waste, plastic-free economy, then here are things that you can do to push decision makers to get us to where we need to be. And I think that's kind of the key in the evolution of the Break Free from Plastic, plastic free July movements, is that we need to be taking the onus off each person to be trying to carry the entire plastic free load on their shoulders, and instead give them the tools and empower them to be calling for the investment in the shift that we need.
And one of the kind of key phrases that I see pop up in a number of places to try and just help people imagine this and imagine that it is not unreasonable to demand this is this notion of a reuse revolution.
Yeah.
This is a powerful idea, I think, and something that I would love to see scaled up. I mean, here in Halifax, we've seen a business called the Tear Shop
Yeah.
struggle, actually, in the context of the pandemic to sustain its reuse and refill model. They had to shut down their Halifax location, actually. And so, that was disheartening, right? Like on the local level to see people and I know like you gave an interview where you talked about how you're more broadly kind of invested in trying to make people sort of anxious about their attachment to convenience.
Hmm.
From your perspective, why would the change to reuse and refill be revolutionary, right? You're calling it a revolution. It seems like, in a way, such a small thing, but you're suggesting it's actually a new foundation, I think, in a sense, one that both eliminates single use and disposable items, but also takes aim at the model of convenience, of endless growth. I mean, single use plastics are a profit maker, right? In what sense does it do both the local and the global, the macro and the micro, to sort of think in terms of the reasonableness, the possibility of a reuse and refill model being mandated across the board?
Yeah, I mean, I think when we think about a transition to a reuse centered economy, and I definitely want to emphasize that it would be a just transition, as in centering justice in that process. It really would signal the end of the plastic era, and that is, that's what we're trying to do, because that also, means that it's the end of our hyper fossil fuel dependent era, which we know we need to do if we're going to be living on a planet that we can all exist on. There's so many people working so hard to just keep a small reuse refill business alive.
It's true, yeah.
You mentioned the Terra Shop, which I totally was aware of, but I know so many zero waste and refill businesses that are either struggling or have had to close or are probably going to have to close because it's just a constant battle to try to operate within our current economy and our fossil fuel centric system,
Mm-hmm.
where the wrong things are valued and the right things are either undervalued or not valued at all. So a reuse revolution is, I mean, it is happening, but it's about really the transition to an actual circular economy that is compatible with meeting all of these biodiversity and climate and zero waste targets. It's what is going to help us get there, and is required in order to truly achieve that. And so it is bigger than, okay, let's just swap out some reusables or swap out some single use for reusables here and there. It's a worldwide shift that we need, that has started, that we need to accelerate in order to meet our other planetary and social justice goals.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, like the way that you articulate this notion of the circular economy for Greenpeace to me is a pretty visionary post plastics policy, and yet where I have seen the concept pop up, it's mostly been, and you also identify this, like kind of co-opted by the plastics industry.
Yeah.
I mean, like even the UN's Environment Assembly, its plastics treaty pushes for a move toward the safe and non-toxic circularity of plastics, or like an effort to repurpose plastics as part of the circular economy. But what you're saying is, quote, there is no such thing as a circular economy for plastics. So I wanted to ask you about this. I mean, does a circular economy model for plastics, of the type advocated by the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, for example, just represent another delay tactic? Is it a misleading technological fix? And if a circular economy were to exist, would it necessarily mean adopting very strict anti-plastic legislation?
It's definitely a delay tactic, and it
Mm,
definitely focuses on technological fixes.
right.
And I mean, ultimately, when the concept of a circular economy for plastics was first created, it was about engaging the business community in being part of, definitely not the solution, but a solution, thinking about how to address this massive problem of plastic waste and pollution and their contribution to it. And I think that what it actually is, though, is just a fancier way of saying, let's try to make plastic less problematic. Let's try to recycle it more. Let's try to come up with new ways of recycling. But it ignores the fact that plastic ultimately, as we know, is a fossil fuel. It ignores that just due to the nature of plastic, it's always going to become waste. And if not waste, how many park benches do we really need? Like when we talk about downcycling,
Mm-hmm.
it ignores the energy inputs required. It ignores the fact that, yeah, like we're at a place in terms of plastic production globally where it's just not possible to capture everything that's been produced. So we would have to be at a very different place in our plastic production journey and plastic use journey as a global society to be thinking of plastic from a circular place. Best case scenario, you're only using a couple different types of polymers that are shown to be the least toxic, the most recyclable. You can keep them in a loop for a super long time, and then the waste process is also not problematic and
Mm-hmm.
not polluting. But I mean, that is harder than actually a just transition to a reuse centered system.
Yeah.
It's harder and it's more energy intensive and it's more costly and it's more polluting and it's more damaging, and it's just not worth it. We know where
Mm-hmm.
we need to go to actually address the plastic waste and pollution crisis. We know that we have to dramatically reduce overall production of plastic, and we need to rely on other systems, truly circular systems that are actually zero waste. And so there's just no way that plastic can be a mainstay in the economy.
That to me really encapsulates the sort of the planet we want to inhabit, and makes it so patently obvious, like that in a lot of ways there's just an attachment to the existing system that seems to block ideologically, basically, and politically block the emergence of a healthier system. If we wanted to rely on just sort of human reason, it would be enough to just sort of like bottle that message and disseminate it, and then hope for the transformation. But the fact of the matter is, we're seeing the ways in which, like, especially overdeveloped nations like Canada really lag behind others in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I see in a number of places people saying, including your writing, like Canada could be a leader, right? And yet there is no real push clearly within at least the liberal government to hold companies accountable for the full life cycle of plastics. And so, yeah, I wondered if you could, because I know you have a background in environmental law and policy. I wondered if you could help people understand the sort of like legal background basically here that allows companies, in spite of the reasonableness of energy transition, phase out, like the obviousness of the need to kind of do that, what it is about the legal environment that permits pollution, that allows for, to a certain extent, like spills and leaks and explosions even to happen fairly regularly.
Canada loves to project as an environmental leader, and with pretty strong laws and policies on the environment. But the reality is that everything from the Fisheries Act to the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, there's just always a loophole. There's always a way that industry can move forward to do something similar to the status quo, whether it is the BPA versus other biphenol examples, or whether it's mitigating destruction of a stream that salmon inhabit, or allegedly mitigating the risk to salmon. There's always a way that industry can move forward. It's very rare that industry is truly held accountable. A recent one, actually, it's unrelated to plastic, but related to deep sea mining, where you may have seen that the federal government announced that currently in Canada, there isn't law or policy related to deep sea mining, and therefore there is an effective moratorium. They're not saying Canada, there is a moratorium in Canadian waters, full stop. They're saying we don't have this law or policy. If we did, it would need to be rigorous in order for mining to move ahead. And I feel like that's like an example of what it always is. It's that we don't want to give you a hard no, so that industry can remain happy and the environment hopefully is in a bit of a better place, or we bide a little bit of time. And with the single-use plastics ban, of course, there are a lot of businesses that are impacted by that ban, but there are also a lot of loopholes and measures in place that mean that some businesses that are impacted, like producers that are impacted by the ban, can just produce more of something else.
Right.
The Canadian government is very scared, as we know, to really take strong action to hold industry across sectors accountable. And it's always more of a collaborative approach with industry, and industry is prioritized in the creation of policy. And I think, that obviously comes as no surprise to anybody that follows these issues. It'll be interesting to see now with, again, climate commitments, biodiversity commitments, whether or not that shift will finally happen, because we need stronger and clearer law in Canada if we're truly going to make those goals. And when it comes to plastic, their strategy towards 2030, where they, hope to meet zero plastic waste, they have to be looking at that knowing that it's impossible. So we need a law overhaul in Canada. And, we're seeing some of that. We're seeing there's so much work being done by various groups across the country to improve, for example, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, to improve the Fisheries Act, to improve the Oceans Act. But these things take time. That's why with plastic, we now have a piece of what we need by, having plastic manufactured items listed under the Canadian Environmental Protection Act. We have that. So theoretically, things should move faster around regulating problem plastics. But yeah, so then it just comes back to political will.
That's remarkable, right? That it comes down to political will. And I on that question, Greenpeace has partnerships with Environmental Defense, the David Suzuki Foundation, among many, many others. And you've noted that it's really been members of the public and these sorts of organizations joining together in order to get something like that is potentially transformative on the books, put into law. But what you're saying is that we need to now push, right? Because even that was difficult, like listing plastics on the toxic substances list under the CEPA, that was fought against, right? By the chemicals industry. They fought tooth and nail to shut that down. And
it still is being fought. Yeah. Legally.
It still is being fought. And so it is almost like a war. It feels, interestingly to me, like I think Emily Eaton called it a contest of stubbornness, like who can be more stubborn.
Yeah.
And so, I think what Greenpeace is articulating is like really helpful in terms of to use this unfortunate, in some ways, war metaphor, unfortunately fitting perhaps, like war metaphor, kind of arm people with the knowledge that they need in order to not become like complacent. On one level, it's about knowledge, I think, trying to make it clear to people that there have been no reduction targets. For example, that there's been no targeting really of the production stage except for mandating 50% recycled content in plastic. There's been no serious consideration of the need for this reuse, refill kind of revolution. And there's, importantly, no ban on plastic exports either. So like that is like that's the knowledge part of it, in a sense, like making these omissions, these strategic omissions, really obvious to people. But then the other part of it is political will, as you say. And I guess, like, to what extent are you conscious of the need to like build solidarity here? Like, for example, calling for a ban on plastic exports is about a kind of international solidarity with those that are, living in Malaysia or the Philippines and who are still suffering the like legacy of colonization in the form of becoming the dumping grounds for our plastic waste. So could you speak to the these partnerships with other organizations, how political will in part comes from trying to build that solidarity, and how like that solidarity maybe needs to expand and keep expanding past just like investments in preserving those that look like you, for example?
Yeah, definitely building the counter lobby is key, because the lobby is strong. It's
Right.
it's big oil, it's big plastic, and then it's their allies in terms of those who are relying on these products, and that is a massive, massive, massive lobby. And we've definitely seen a shift in terms of public support for more regulation around plastic. Without a doubt, the overwhelming majority of people living in Canada want to see stronger action taken to ban single-use plastics, keep it out of the waste streams, keep it out of the environment. But the reality is that not everybody, has the bandwidth or the ability to be lobbying their MP every day, or really just being a daily part of the push. And so when it comes to our call to start by expanding the existing single-use plastics ban, we have been focusing on showing that the environmental community, but even more broadly, key members of the health advocacy community, of the small business and other reuse services community, are all aligned on what we want the government to be looking at next in terms of expanding the ban and tackling this broader category of single-use plastics and packaging. We tend to, when it comes to environmental issues in the environmental, and various movements, you have different organizations with different priorities, and you're probably aligned on a whole lot of things. And then you're less aligned on other things because you just, you have different priorities that your supporters are interested in, and that, you want to be focusing your attention on. But we felt like it was really important to say no, from Greenpeace to this small, mom and pop reuse business over here, we all agree that the government isn't taking strong enough action, and we all agree that this is a list that you need to be prioritizing. And right now we're at over 70 signatories on an open letter to Minister Guilbeault and Minister Duclos, Minister of the Environment, and Minister of Health, calling on them to urgently revisit the ban list. And we hope that list will keep growing, and that we will continue to make the counter movement more visible, and also elevate those in the movement that have less of a voice, and that are being the most impacted by the lack of action by the federal government, either to address the pollution side of things or to address the lack of investment in the refill side of things. Our work on the Global Plastic Treaty, Greenpeace is part of the large Break Free from Plastic movement that has, well over 1,000 organizations all working together, representing, all different interests in the issue of, moving to a plastic-free future. And through that coalition, again, we really want to be elevating the voices and the perspectives of those that are impacted, and have the government, global governments, be forced to, look them in the face while they're also, having their side lobby meeting with industry to counter it. Because the reality is that, many groups don't have access. They can't plead their case.
Yeah, I mean, you've spoken really, pointedly about the specific precarity of low-income communities, the relationship between plastics, pollution, and environmental racism. It's worth emphasizing that it's really largely been communities of color that have been at the vanguard of kind of pushing for regulations around PFAS. Creating these partnerships to create the counter movement that you described to me is so urgent. And so I'm definitely interested to hear you speak to kind of like where you've seen more radical solutions emerge, maybe in other countries. I know Rwanda has a really extensive plastics ban. But I guess, I wanted to give you an opportunity to elaborate on like the specifics of Greenpeace's goals, right? Because one of the things that you've said, for example, is that the federal government's like trying to still drag its feet. That it's clear it isn't one step on a path. The banning of 6 single-use plastics. It's like the Liberals regard this as the destination. Like this is adequate for them. And you've kind of gestured to this a few times. It is going to become clear to people that there is a fundamental disconnect between this measure and a zero plastic waste policy. It's just like there's a massive chasm between those two things. And that, the problem is dire. People increasingly understand the problem is really dire. And so what Greenpeace is pushing for is to initially add another 6 especially toxic and problematic plastics to the ban. There's an insistence on the need to ban all takeout containers, and like pouches and wrappers, films and wrap, and these, filtered cigarettes and these kinds of things, produce stickers, right? And I wondered, first of all, why these 6 are the main targets of the Expand the Ban campaign. Things like film, produce stickers, these are important targets for Greenpeace. And then there's, of course, also this insistence on the need to eliminate other polymers like PVC and chemical additives. Like those are so important. And it feels radical, but yet, from a radically environmentalist point of view, it's also in some ways incremental, right?
Yeah.
So how do you think about the strategy element of that, right? Where you have to make it concrete, as it were, but also keep pushing in that direction of trying to expand toward a properly circular economy.
So in creating this list, really wanted to think through where are we seeing momentum in certain sectors or in other parts of the world or even within Canada on certain items. So there's like a proof of concept for a switch to, a non-single use, i.e. a reuse, refill, or zero package alternative. We also wanted to consider, as part of that, whether or not just alternatives exist, so alternative models or systems exist. Of course, super critical is what are the things that are still most regularly ending up in the environment, collected through shoreline and community cleanups across Canada, but also globally. So, on the issue of exports, what are things that low grade, rarely recycled plastics that we'd be likely to export elsewhere? And we wanted to look at categories that will actually lead to real change in sectors, i.e. that will force companies to change their model. So the elimination, they can't just make a switch to a different type of plastic wrap or a different type of plastic container, but they actually have to change the model.
Right.
When we then compared some of the items that came up through those conversations against what the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment had also been looking at, of course, there's overlap there. And so recently, last year, the Canadian Council of Ministers of the Environment came out with a roadmap on single-use plastics, and they kind of did another assessment of known problematic plastics, and they then prioritized them based on how problematic they are from an environmental, but also from a waste management perspective. And I definitely don't agree with the outcome of how they've chosen to or how they propose to address those that have been prioritized, but I definitely do agree with the list of plastics that they've been assessing. It's of course not comprehensive, but there were some on there, and it was really revealing that this group of ministers across the country, kind of agree that a massive number of single-use plastics and types of packaging used across Canada are super problematic and need to be addressed in some way. So, yeah, when we consider all of that, we kind of landed on some categories of products and packaging, and then as well as kind of a list of highly problematic polymers, chemical additives, and certain types that we've also seen momentum in other jurisdictions around. So an example would be phthalates or PVC. Some of these chemicals and polymers, the EU, for example, or other countries are already have already looked at. So then it should be easier, an easier sell. That's how we got to our list.
Clearly a lot of strategy, right? Like a lot of thinking went into that particular list. And it has to do with political will, proof of concept, as you put it, and momentum.
And, definitely the list that the government created initially, as meaning the first 6 single-use plastics that have been banned in Canada, it definitely struck me that they were the lower hanging fruit. Of course, they are problematic in the environment because most are, and they're problematic in waste streams because most are. But they were the ones that there was already, quite a bit of action being taken by municipalities in other jurisdictions and in other countries. So it was kind of an easy move, but it didn't represent, obviously the extent of the problem. And when we think about where most people are interacting with the bulk of plastic packaging, it's at the grocery store. And the current ban will really have very, very little impact on a person's, daily or weekly visit to the grocery store. And I think that when the existing ban has fully gone into effect, I really hope that we see really positive impacts in communities and in the environment and in the cleanup data and in waste streams for those items. But I don't think people are going to all of a sudden be like, wow, I'm so glad the plastic ban has gone into effect because my life is so much more plastic free now. The existing single-use plastic ban only represents around 3% of plastic waste generated in Canada. So we have a long way to go before we really notice a difference, both, in our blue bins and our waste streams and in the environment.
It's low-hanging fruit for the government in the sense of shifting, toward an environmental response while at the same time appeasing people that are deeply attached to a certain kind of culture of convenience. It's a tiny little incremental change that is going to anger industry, but perhaps not enough for them to be able to take legal recourse. So it's like low hanging fruit in the sense of a kind of like political realism or just kind of like need to conveniently compromise in order to get like anything done. But the real, like, the danger there is that while that, low hanging fruit gets plucked, there is still a kind of raging war against nature. I mean, like, this is to me the kind of fundamental reality that you and others are trying to make apparent to people that maybe are in these enclaves of kind of convenience where they don't have to confront the reality of the explosive and volatile effects of a fossil fuel economy. And so, I mean, like, to kind of get at this question, I guess I wanted to quote an article that you wrote where you're writing about the biodiversity crisis especially, and you emphasize that humans are part of nature, and then you say for better or worse, which I found really, resonant with my own misanthropy to a certain extent. Like, I believe in the possibility of a climate revolution. I really fundamentally do. I believe that it's necessary. But what you're saying in this article is that the destruction of nature and the oppression of nature stewards is rooted in colonialism, and that we need to swap out our anthropocentric lens and have this like openness, this radical openness to the idea that a more, let's say, sustainable, but really fundamentally a more radically salutary and survivable world is possible. And I guess my question is, like, first of all, do you see value in imagining the mobilization for an end to plastics or an end to fossil fuels? Do you see value in trying to invoke this language of a kind of war? Because it's something that often gets sort of played with in climate communication, right? The idea that there is this war on nature and we need to reckon with it, And then also, do you see, like, maybe more value in something that is a little bit more kind of oriented toward care and things like indigenous-led conservation or protection of nature?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a long time the war language was, more what, advocacy organizations like Greenpeace, would invoke. We need to fight.
Mm-hmm.
We need to win. We need to give it to them, essentially, whoever the them
Right.
was in the context.
Need to mobilize.
We need to mobilize. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I actually catch myself a lot, even much stronger language than that sometimes, being like, I think it is worth thinking through, like, do we want to fight violence with violent language, violence to nature, violence to people? It is a fight, but I think part of it is that we hear so much about eco anxiety, and I think so many people are in a state of fight or flight in their own bodies so much of the time now, whether it's because of the communities in which they live are constantly experiencing, all kinds of harms and crises, or because just in their own, personal life, they're just like trying to get through the day. And then you add on top of that the eco anxiety, and I think it's too much. And we're learning a lot more about how eco anxiety is impacting people, and it's causing people to shut down even further, which is definitely not what we need. And I think a shift to more of a, we can do this, we can do it through care, through uplifting, like, the bright lights within society, the examples of hope, the examples of progress. It doesn't have to be all roses and kittens, because it certainly isn't. But I think part of centering justice and trying to move towards a model of, Indigenous-led conservation, and, putting the people that are the most impacted in various contexts in the middle of crafting solutions and a way forward. We do have to be mindful of how, sometimes our metaphors and our language are negatively impacting, their ability to show up, or feel that there may be in a movement that's inspiring. There's so much around, hope versus doom and all of it. And I'm not sure exactly where I land on it. I don't think I'm either one. I think both are important to raise awareness and then mobilize, because I think some people do need to be shocked out of their state,
Yeah. Their aloofness, the kind of, the indifference,
the indifference,
right? Flight can mean indifference,
Yes, totally. So I think probably both have a role, but I think we have to be mindful of who we're trying to communicate to and mobilize and work with and be allies to when we're thinking of how we're talking about the transition that we need and how we need to get there.
Yeah, for sure. I think I agree that, you use a metaphor in one article, for example, the plastic cage, right? Like that it's sort of hard to imagine ways out of what you call our plastic cage.
Yeah.
And the plastic cage metaphor is maybe, the one that sticks with me the most, because, a plastic cage is extraordinarily durable, and yet it can be sort of malleable. You might not even see that it's there. Plastic is a thing that many of us imagine does protect us in sort of this impermeable bubble.
Yeah.
But it is nonetheless, something that we are encasing ourselves in. I love this idea that we need to think more radically, that we need to craft solutions in order to move toward a circular economy that in some ways might feel inconvenient, but one that will mean operating, as you say, within nature's limits, which is the opposite of where we are. And that might mean leaving certain things behind. But those things it's good and right to leave some of those things behind.
Yeah.
We can do it, as you say.
Definitely. Just one thing that you mentioned that I've been increasingly thinking about over the last couple of years is like how everything is through the anthropocentric lens. And when you really stop to, I have a 2-year-old kid now, and just from such an early age, the stories, like from nursery rhymes to to suggested activities for kids, to it's all about like how are we using nature, how can nature benefit us. It's everywhere in our society.
I know what you mean.
Everything is about how are we benefiting from it. It's one that is kind of the ultimate shift, is our relationship with nature. Yeah, and that we are part of it. That is ultimately going to be the biggest shift we need to be addressing not just our planetary crises, but also our social justice crises around the world, because obviously they're so linked.
Yeah, I mean, this idea of a kind of education in like what we might call a kind of instrumental rationality, this idea that it's appropriate to instrumentalize nature to make it, but it's just pure extractivism. So like definitely thinking through how that manifests itself in like children's literature would be, fascinating. Maybe you could come back and we'll do an episode on that.
That would be great. Yeah. I've been thinking probably way too much about it and analyzing way too many things. Yeah.
And even thinking about like Richard Scarry and Busy Town and the kind of like obsession with being useful in Thomas the Tank Engine, all this stuff. It's like, what is with the productivism of all of it?
Totally. It's almost like all of it is problematic. It's like we need to, we just can't keep telling the same stories over and over as if that's normal. It's not worked out for us as a society.
And I wonder what a post-plastics kind of allegory would look like, in the context of children's literature. Anyway, we should save that for episode 2.
Okay.
But it's been great talking to you. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much for doing this.
You too. Thanks so much for reaching out. It's been a really great discussion.